This is the first presentation in a series that I've entitled Insights from Ezekiel. In this presentation, we'll look at the book that Ezekiel wrote overall and consider how God shows himself to Ezekiel at the start. Insights from Ezekiel. We might describe Ezekiel as a priest-prophet. He'd been trained as a priest in Jerusalem. Then he was called to be a prophet to the exiles, those who had been deported to Babylon. He was born about 623 BC. He dates his records pretty precisely, and they start in 593 BC. He'd be about 30 years of age when he started recording what God had said to him and what he had to pass on. He'd been taken with others as an exile. He'd been deported by the Babylonians. He'd been taken to an area which in today's world is part of modern-day Iraq. Living in a foreign country with a group of his people who'd been exiled. God spoke to him and wanted to speak through him to the exiles in Babylon. We know he was a young married man. Like all the rest of the deportees, they'd been taken to Babylon against their will. But he did possess great spiritual sensitivity. He was open to God, to hear God, and he was highly creative in the way he communicated. And he was given that awesome responsibility. These people had been deported. They were now totally out of their own culture, working in a land that was not their own, in a culture that was very different. They were lost. They were confused. Ezekiel is sent to help them to make sense of what had happened to them. And as we'll discover, they weren't prepared to listen at the start. Because what had happened to them happened because of what they themselves had done. And God showed Ezekiel, and through Ezekiel them, that they needed to change their thinking and behavior, and change it in radical ways. And over many years Ezekiel lived and worked among the exiles. He brought them deep spiritual insights from God. But his book is in many ways strange because he used highly creative and novel ways to communicate for very good reasons. So we're going to be looking in this series at insights that he brings to us. Insights that he brought from God to a people who had been deported and exiled against their will, separated from their culture and the securities of their own systems. There are deep parallels, as we shall see, with what is facing the church in the West today. This book has major insights which can help us to move forward. Let's start by looking at the map. You can see at the left-hand side Jerusalem, the capital of the tiny land of Judah. Judah had been overrun many times. The bigger land of Israel to the north had been wiped out by the Assyrians. The Assyrians had their capital at Nineveh. Nineveh had been captured and destroyed by the Babylonians, and the Babylonian Empire, which was based further south in the Euphrates area, the Babylonian Empire had taken over, and it had spread its power all over the area, reaching right across to Egypt in the west, and only stopped by the mountains in the north and the desert in the south. A short-lived empire, but very powerful, highly sophisticated, but very brutal. And the exiles were taken to a place, a location, south of the city of Babylon. Crops grew through irrigation. There were irrigation canals there, so they were by the Kibar River or the Kibar Canal. That's where they were based. No doubt having to grow their own food and survive in that area. Now the Babylonians kept very good records. What they tell us is that there was a siege of Jerusalem under Nebuchadnezzar, who later became the emperor in Babylon. It started in December 598 BC, and the city fell the following March. And Nebuchadnezzar and his army rampaged through the area. They stripped Jerusalem of anything that was wealthy, including all the artifacts of the temple that were made of gold or silver. They're taken to Babylon. But it was part of the policy of the Babylonians to deport populations and move them around, partly to where they were needed, but partly to break up cultures and to break up resistance. So they took away about 8,000 deportees from the Jerusalem area, but they took the people from the top of society, the people with power, wealth and influence, people who were qualified in some way. Ezekiel was part of that group. And it was a long walk. The exiles really went through it. They'd been marched by the army going north through the mountainous areas now that are part of Lebanon, Syria, and then south down the Euphrates Valley. Only able to carry what they could carry. They'd lost their possessions. Nebuchadnezzar, meantime, had set up a puppet king called Zedekiah, who was from the royal family, but Nebuchadnezzar reckoned he was pliable enough to do what Nebuchadnezzar wanted, and he was installed in Jerusalem. But the city had been messed up by the Babylonians, and the wealth had been stripped away. But life went on, and you can see that in the prophecies of Jeremiah, who was speaking to the people at that time in Jerusalem. Now, if we look at 2 Kings, we can find the biblical record. And the biblical record is amazingly consistent with the Babylonian records, giving us great confidence that the biblical writers had it right. And it paints a similar picture, but this time the picture is described from the perspective of the people who lived in Judah. These deportees, you could regard them as the kind of cream of the nation of Judah. They took away the people who might be future leaders, who might cause trouble. People who are qualified in various ways that could be useful to the Babylonians. But the problem was, these people saw themselves as God's chosen people, if you like, God's favourites. They had misunderstood what chosenness actually means. God is never unfair, and he only chooses people for tasks, never on merit, and never because they're special. But they misunderstood that. They saw themselves as God's chosen people. They could do what they liked. God gave them the ability just to run their own lives. Their ethical behavior did not matter. And what had happened in the land of Judah was that the ruling classes had made a very comfortable lifestyle for themselves, and the legal system, the religious system, and the royal system were all in it together, each supporting the other. But they did that at the expense of the wider nation, who were struggling to survive. Their ethical behavior was simply atrocious. But they couldn't see the fault in themselves. We're God's chosen people. We're okay. So when things went wrong, they blamed others. It's all the fault of the Babylonians. Oh, how much we see this kind of attitude today. A superiority complex that then blames others when things go wrong. They had their God, Yahweh, but they saw God as residing in the temple in Jerusalem, and that posed a problem for them when they were taken to Babylon. Couldn't get their heads around that. They'd lost their God. But they believed God would intervene, God would save them, God would rescue them. They were God's chosen people after all. God wouldn't let the temple be smashed up. God wouldn't let the nation be destroyed. God would look after them. They had that naive belief. So they believed that God would intervene to restore their city, to protect their temple, to restore the kingdom of Israel and put back the rightful king on the throne again, and to give them back their national freedom. They failed to grasp the reality of the situation. So one of them wrote a psalm when they were in Babylon, and here's just 2 verses. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion, the city of God, Jerusalem. How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? You see, they thought that God resided in Jerusalem. They were separated from their God. How can we sing the songs of the Lord in a foreign land? That reflects their mental attitude. But what about Ezekiel himself? He'd been trained as a priest, trained to carry out his priestly duties, and by age 25, which was when he was taken as part of the group of exiles, he would have been fully qualified. But now he was away from the temple. He was away from all the rituals. He was away from his duties. It doesn't say so, but perhaps he was a bit lost because his career had suddenly been stripped away from him. He was away in a foreign country, in a different culture. And the people who were the wealthy cream of society suddenly found they had to roll up their sleeves and grow crops just simply to survive. And the deportees around him simply were not willing to listen to what God was saying. And we'll see in this series how God warned Ezekiel about this and how Ezekiel got around it. How God directed him and led him. They did not and were not willing to consider that they brought the disasters on themselves. They'd let their nation fall apart, living selfishly. There was the elite group that ran the system for themselves, and the vast majority of the people who were struggling to survive. Society was divided. It was bound to implode. It was too weak to survive any attack from any people group round about. They brought this on themselves by their behavior. And God simply wasn't going to come and magically restore everything. They had to be willing to put their house in order. They had to be willing to live God's way, the best way. And God wouldn't simply come and restore everything when it was back in the evil way that they were running life. And they were not willing to accept that in due time the temple and Jerusalem would be completely razed to the ground. When Nebuchadnezzar came He created havoc in the city, but he didn't flatten it completely. He left it. He took anything of value that he could steal, but he left the city. The deportees thought, well, God will intervene and it'll all be put back. Ezekiel had to bring them the message, no it won't. You've got to put your house in order first. And Ezekiel knew that Jerusalem and its temple would be completely destroyed, and it was. How was Ezekiel, this young man, about age 30, how was he to communicate to the deportees who were simply not prepared to listen? Their minds were closed. How was he to get through to them? This is a real problem. It's been a real problem down through the centuries with people group after people group. How can God communicate with people who refuse to listen, who think they know better? And Ezekiel was mandated to bring the message to them. How was he to tackle this impossible task? Now we stop and ponder for a moment. There are close parallels with the people of God in the West today. As numbers decline, as influence deteriorates, as laws are being passed that make living for Jesus more difficult, our minds are often closed to the fact that we brought this on ourselves because we have focused on running our religious systems and so often lost the living for Jesus as the central reason for our existence. You see, these deportees, these exiles, they saw no fault in how they behaved. They just simply didn't get it. They thought it was okay to live comfortable, cozy lives at the expense of the majority of the people, the rabble. They'd become a ruling class. And again, we see that in the West in many nations today. There has developed a ruling class. And the majority don't share in their wealth. And the deportees were looking for some magical intervention from God. Oh, today so often in the churches we're looking for revival round the corner. God longs to revive and renew. But he won't revive what is corrupted and faulty. And we've got to look closely at ourselves, as these deportees had to, and it was hard going for them. It took them a long time, many years, for the penny to drop. Ezekiel had to work at it. So that's probably how he felt. And indeed, a description from time to time you can see. His mind was blown. His spiritual mind was confused. He was struggling. But he was willing. You see, there was flawed thinking. And when we have flawed thinking, we need a process of deconstruction before there can be reconstruction. You see, we like the reconstruction, the positive, the revival round the corner. But as these deportees, these exiles had to discover, there has to be a deconstruction. The mindsets we've got have got to be taken apart and exposed to what God is saying. And when they're faulty, they've got to be corrected. You see, that's what the religious leadership in Jerusalem, that's their characteristic. They were depending on ritual performance as pleasing to God. And if you like, they were kind of crossing their fingers that the tide of religious decline would be reversed in due time. there are parallels with what we see in the West today. Deconstruction is tough, it's painful, it's hard, it's difficult. It requires an honesty before God before we can get the positive reconstruction. And the reconstruction can come when we recognize, when we realize we have to have a radical overhaul of what we're doing and how we're behaving, how we're treating each other, how we're treating wider society. And we'll see these patterns in subsequent presentations coming up very clearly in what Ezekiel is saying. You see, that's the big problem. How many people today in church circles have looked at it and said, okay, we can do it a bit better. We're doing the same, but doing it a bit better. That's not what God is in the business of. God is in the business of radical renewal. It's not a question of tinkering. It's a question of deconstruction, taking the whole thing apart, going back to the drawing board and starting again. And that's the tough job that Ezekiel faced, to get that message across to his listeners who were not willing to consider any radical rethinking. They'd lost their land. They were deportees. They'd lost their temple. They were miles away from it. They'd lost their king. He was taken into exile, and a puppet king established on the throne. And sometimes it takes the loss of everything to challenge all our assumptions. Sometimes it takes God to take away all the familiar landmarks of spiritual life, and it challenges us to fresh thinking. Because too often we're trying to adjust what we are doing and make it work a bit better, rather than saying, what does God really want from us? What's the fresh thinking that He's got for us? And all the familiar landmarks, the key points of their lives, land, temple, kingship, the things that made them feel they were the chosen people of God, they were special. Yahweh their God in the temple in Jerusalem. All is well. They performed their religious rituals meticulously. But strip that lot away, go back to the drawing board, and in the land of Babylon, by the river Kibar, by the canal system there, they were forced in a different way of life to think things through afresh. And Ezekiel started that process. You see, Ezekiel was aware of that, and if we look at Jeremiah, who was his contemporary but older, who worked in Jerusalem, and Isaiah, who'd worked essentially before in Jerusalem, they were both aware of that, and others too. God's reputation in the wider world is linked to God's people. People round about can only see God when they see something of God in us, the followers of Jesus. Put it in the modern era. How do we behave? What do we do? What do we say? What's our lifestyle? What's our activities? Most important of all, how do we treat other people? God's reputation is tied up tightly to His people. Absolutely central idea. We can see this most vividly in the life of Jesus. Jesus lived before the watching world, God in human flesh. God's reputation was seen in the life of Jesus, and the aim of Jesus is God's reputation, Jesus living, will be seen in Jesus' people, His followers today, and down through the ages. Sadly, we've so often let Him down. The people had drifted so far away from godly living that God just allowed the disasters to happen. They happened stage by stage, but the people simply wouldn't listen. They wouldn't listen to the prophets of the past. They wouldn't listen to Isaiah. They wouldn't listen to Jeremiah. And there were many others. They were living lives that did not reflect the way of Jesus. And God just allowed the disasters to happen so that their eyes would be opened, the penny would drop. We're now in the final stage of revelation. See, God does want to restore. He does want the best. He wants life of the highest quality for us all. He wants to renew, revive. But He cannot do it when we're not willing to have it done. Because we want to hang on running it our way. And we're living selfishly for the benefit of us. And we think that running our religious systems will make God happy. God never mandated us to run religious systems. Jesus never came to restore a good religious system. Jesus came to bring in the kingdom where people live the Jesus way by His grace and power. But before He can really start, God needs to move Ezekiel's thinking forward. He's open. Perhaps by his training, perhaps by his very nature, perhaps by his spirituality. But he was open, but he needed his thinking moved forward. He needed to be equipped to communicate to the deportees, a virtually impossible task at a human level. And chapter 1 describes God seeking to move Ezekiel forward. So let's finish this presentation by looking at chapter 1 very briefly. In my 30th year, Ezekiel writes, in the 4th month on the 5th day, while I was among the exiles by the river Kibar, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin. That was the king that was taken into exile. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, by the river Kibar in the land of the Babylonians. There the hand of the Lord was on him. We can precisely date it. They'd been in exile for perhaps 5 years. They'd settled there. They got their agriculture going. They were surviving of a sort. And there's a vision of God. And the great thing that Ezekiel got is God is not restricted to living in a temple in Jerusalem. God is everywhere, even by the canals around the Kibar area in Babylon. God is there, and God can speak. I looked, and I saw a violent storm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning surrounded by brilliant light. The centre of the fire looked like glowing metal, and in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In appearance their form was human, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight, their feet were like those of a calf, and gleamed like burnished bronze. Under their wings on their 4 sides they had human hands. All 4 of them had faces and wings, and the wings of one touched the wings of another. Each one went straight ahead, they did not turn as they moved. Blows the mind when we read that. The vision representing God's presence could move in any direction. God was everywhere. God was in control. Now, in fact, there's a vision in chapter 10 which expands it slightly and shows that the living creatures described here are the seraphim, the powerful angels in the presence of God. It goes on, their faces looked like this. Each of the 4 had the face of a human being. On the right side had the face of a lion, on the left the face of an ox. Each also had the face of an eagle. Such were their faces. Each had 2 wings spreading out upwards. Each wing touched that of the creatures on either side, and each had 2 other wings covering his body. Each one went straight ahead. Wherever the Spirit would go, they would go, without turning as they went. The appearance of the living creatures was like burning coals of fire, or like torches. Fire moved back and forth among the creatures. It was bright. Lightning flashed out of it. The creatures sped back and forth like flashes of lightning. Now the imagery that's used here, and Ezekiel is almost tripping over the language. He's having a great problem describing this. But this imagery is drawn from the language of the time, and it pictures God as all-powerful and all-knowing. God was much bigger than a God who resided in a temple in Jerusalem. The lion speaks of royalty. The eagle speaks of speed. The cattle speaks of value. Humans, the divine image. Now all these pictures and models are in the literature of the time. And God was communicating to Ezekiel using ideas that he'd be familiar with through his studies. God encompasses everything that's wonderful. Strength, majesty, swiftness, mobility. Procreative power is the great creator. Wisdom and reason. God is the Lord of the universe. God is everywhere. In this imagery, there are great and deep messages that Ezekiel would get. As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the ground beside each creature with its 4 faces. This was the appearance and structure of the wheels. They sparkled like topaz, and all 4 looked alike. Each appeared to me like a wheel intersecting a wheel. As they moved, they would go in any one of the 4 directions the creatures faced. The wheels did not change direction as the creatures went. The rims were high and awesome, and all 4 rims were full of eyes all around. When the living creatures moved, the wheels beside them moved. When the creatures rose from the ground, the wheels also rose. Wherever the Spirit would go, they would go, and the wheels would rise along with them, because the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. When the creatures moved, they also moved. When the creatures stood still, they also stood still. When the creatures rose from the ground, the wheels rose along with them, because the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. Don't try to draw this. In fact, the language Ezekiel uses, he's tripping over language forms all over the place. He's struggling to describe it. His mind is blown. A remarkable object that could move in any direction, characterized by brilliance and sparkling light. His own source of vitalities. You see, it goes beyond description. This is the symbolism of the presence of God, the Lord of the universe, the God of glory. Our human minds and our drawing abilities could never encompass this. Spread about above the cans of the living creatures was what looked like a vault, sparkling like crystal and awesome. Under the vault their wings were stretched out, one towards the other. Each one had 2 wings covering its body. When the creatures moved, I heard the sound of their wings like the roar of rushing waters, like the voice of the Almighty, like the tumult of an army. When they stood still, they lowered their wings. That's the point in the red box. Ezekiel had been stripped away from the temple and everything that was familiar to him. God resided in the temple in Jerusalem, and suddenly his mind was blown to realize that God was there, and that the God he worshipped was far, far bigger than he had ever understood. And it brought Ezekiel face to face with God. Then there came a voice from above the vault over their heads as they stood with lowered wings. Above the vault over their heads was what looked like a throne of lapis lazuli, the most valuable gemstone of the day. High above them the throne was a figure like that of a man. I saw that from what appeared to be his waist up he looked like glowing metal, as if full of fire, and that from there down he looked like fire, and brilliant light surrounded him. Like the appearance of a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so was the radiance round him. You see, God was being revealed to Ezekiel, accessible, like that of a man. But fire and light, purity and power, the symbolism is very powerful. God's revealing himself to Ezekiel so that Ezekiel could see that God was a way beyond what Ezekiel had already grasped. Ezekiel's horizons were being lifted, expanded. His mind was being blown. It's not a literal picture, so much as using analogy to try and picture it. And it finishes like this. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. When I saw it, I fell face down, and I heard the voice of one speaking. Ezekiel had been brought face to face with the glory of God in this stupendous vision, which we cannot fully describe and we can't draw, because God's bigger than our drawing ability and bigger than our minds. But Ezekiel's reaction was face down, and he was listening. Appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. He struggles with language. But his reaction was to fall face down. And when we come face to face with the reality and grandeur of the Almighty Lord of the universe, we can do nothing else. Now Ezekiel is ready to listen. His mind has been expanded, and God can speak. It's beyond human description, and the prophet's overwhelmed, and the way he uses language and the way he trips over language shows that he has an awful struggle to describe this. So he often resorts to analogy. It's like, and sometimes his language structures go all over the place. It's simply bigger than language, bigger than visualization, bigger than a drawing, because God is bigger than any of these things. Grandeur and brilliance beyond the prophet's power to describe. But Ezekiel fell face down, and now was ready to listen. We've got to recognize that. Number 4 of this and 4 of that occur all over the place. Numbers so often are symbolic in their use in the Old and New Testaments. 4 speaks of universality. And God is enthroned. He's beyond his creation. That's a picture, an idea that's communicated through this vision. But is presented to Ezekiel like a human. God relates to humanity. He made us. We are made in his image and likeness. We are something of what God is, and we do something of what God does. And he can communicate to us. And God has a task for Ezekiel. He's going to give the instructions. And Ezekiel is now ready to receive them. And the penny is dropping with Ezekiel. God is everywhere. Even in Babylon, that had treated them so atrociously. God is there. God is the sovereign Lord of the universe. And God is willing to speak. And that is where we're going next. To see the instructions that were given to Ezekiel. What Ezekiel was being asked to do. What to communicate. And what he would face. So the next presentation looks at Ezekiel's instructions. The directions that God gave him. Now that Ezekiel had grasped something of who God really is.